Hey seekers, what's up? Very often, the journey of seeking is a very solitude and lonely one. Plotinus calls it the flight of the alone to the alone. But in 2020, there's no reason why we need to be doing this all alone. One of the reasons why I started this channel was because I was doing all of this reading and research on my own, and I wanted people to interact with and talk to, and the response and the interaction and the community that's already been built around this in so short of a time has been so fulfilling. So I thought instead of just sharing my own ideas and readings and thoughts with the camera and with you guys, I would invite some of my friends, my colleagues who have been involved in this research and in this study and in this seeking that I've come to know along the time of my search, who have some really great thoughts and great personalities to share with you. And I felt very selfish if I wouldn't be sharing them with you. Many of them have not yet taken the leap to share their thoughts in a public forum yet. So this is my way of cajoling and coercing them to come and share their ideas with the world where they're most needed. And this is my invitation to you as well. If you are here because you're interested in these topics, I'm sure you have some ideas that you would like to share. And if that's the case, please drop me a message. And I would love to interview you. I'd love to hear your story. I'd love to hear you present your ideas and your research, because I think this is going to take an army of people. So, yeah, thank you for watching, as usual. And I hope you enjoy this conversation which follows. In this forthcoming conversation, I present to you Gavi Kutliroff. Gavi is a young philosopher, a writer, musician, and a poet. He studied psychology and East Asian studies at Brandeis. And in this fantastic conversation, we get to talk about the limits of rationality, mysticism and the irrational, the experience of self-alienation in the study of mysticism, and Gavi's thesis comparing the thought of Rabbi Nachman and Zhuangzi, the Daoist thinker, and their ways of dancing around the infinite nothingness. It is a fantastic conversation, and if you come out on the other end the same person, then you were not paying attention. I hope you enjoy. Strap in. Love you. So, Gavi, what are you interested? What are you into?
Oh, in general, like across the board.
Yeah, give us a bit of in general, but like more specifically, I want to know what your like intellectual or
Yeah. So I went to Brandeis University, just graduated last year.
Mhm.
Been living in Israel since, except Chicago for the past month. We'll see what happens after this. But in Brandeis University, I majored in East Asian Studies and
Mhm.
psychology.
Mhm.
So I studied. I had like a long-standing interest in like East Asian, like Chinese, especially Chinese thought.
Mhm.
I've been a little bit dormant, like in the past year, just because I've been more in like a logistical zone, trying to just like get my life together. So I haven't had the chance to get a ton into that kind of stuff again, but it's definitely like an interest that's lying dormant, waiting to wake up again. I've been, especially Daoism, been interested in it for a long time. I wrote my senior thesis comparing Rabbi Nachman of Breslov to the Zhuangzi. I remember me and you talked about this once at your place. Considered like one of the founding fathers of Daoism, the Dao De Jing, which is like a little more well known and popular. I think it's one of the most translated books ever, actually. So it's like a little more mainstream in the West.
One of the
It's
most
kind of
what?
like translated books ever.
Oh, translated.
The
Wow.
Dao De Jing, which is sort of like the he's kind of the precursor to, he's sort of what people credit as like the first Daoist thinker. So Zhuangzi is kind of his number two, and
Mhm.
he like 100 200 years later or something, and I compared the two of them, and they're both I would say two thinkers I definitely deeply admire, even if I'm not actively interested in them at a particular moment. I think my general kind of bent of my sort of like intellectual beliefs tend to be pretty well demonstrated by my like strong interest in those two. I think, which is that like for a few reasons. I think first of all, they're both anti-rational, and I'm pretty skeptical of rationalism in general. or at least in its kind of like in its exclusivist tendency. I think that like rationalism tends to convince you that it's the only way of looking at the world, and I have no problem with using it sometimes, but I don't really buy it as an exclusive outlook on life. Like things don't make sense all the time, and thinking that will get you in sticky situations. And I find that usually views that are irrational, whether that's mystical, like Rabbi Nachman, or just kind of philosophical, just sort of like absurd, just like a different, funny, more liberated way of living in the world, which is more Zhuangzi, less sort of mystical necessarily, but more kind of about that sort of thing. Either one of those things tends to almost be inclusive of the other model. Like they both think that there are times to be rational, but rationalism doesn't tend to think there are times to be otherwise. So I tend to agree with that a lot. And so those are kind of, and that's one of the reasons I like Chinese thought in general is because I think it's very, I think the Western tradition is very tends to be pretty heavily rationalist, and I think that the Chinese definitely have that strain like anywhere else in the world, but they're less interested in truth and more interested in what I've heard referred to sometimes as like the art of living, which I think is like a pretty phrase. Like they're only really interested in something being true insofar as it helps you actually live a better life, whether that means more meaningful or whether that means more efficient or whether that means it gets you what you want or whatever it is. And I'm pretty interested in that. Recently in particular, I've gotten more into, again, I haven't been reading a ton, been out of that kind of thing, but just in terms of where my thinking's been, I've been thinking more like a Buddhist probably, I think. Thinking a lot about kind of like existentialism and where people are and like the nature of like suffering as a part of life and how to deal with that as a human being. And I think that's more germane to our current situation personally and globally, instead of kind of the freer having fun figuring out like interesting ways to live your life thing. I think that tends to be less that it's a heavier, more intense time. So I think I've been thinking along those kind of lines. But I think in general, that's a pretty good reflection of my interests. I've also been, I like history a lot and been reading a lot of history lately, just out of competing around or whatever. I'm reading this fantastic book right now called I'm almost done with it, called The Silk Roads by some guy who's professor at Oxford or Cambridge or somewhere in England on what's it called? Called Peter Frankopan. And it's the Silk Roads, the history of something or other. And it's like basically a history of Central Asia. And having like just like all the stands, like the least studied place in the world that no one ever cares about. So I've been having like a super interesting time reading that kind of thing and thinking about different perspectives on reading history and different ways of I'm always thinking about like different models, different like rationalism, mysticism, logic, this, whatever, and thinking like noticing the way that he tells his story of history and thinking about other ways of telling it and how all that stuff. I don't know. That's kind of a super broad scope of stuff, but that's kind of where my brain tends to be at about these kinds of questions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's actually really epic. And there's like a lot of
there's a lot going on there, but it's kind of
there's a lot going on. There's a lot of like jumping points.
There's a lot of that's a good survey of where my brain's been at for a while.
It's a really great survey, and it's also very like it's a counter narrative survey. And I want to hold like that introduction and then bring it back at the end. But what I want to know is how did you get to a place where you were interested in all these things? Like every intellectual, journey survey has also its human and biological side. So I'm curious in your personal story. So what's your story in your own words?
Yeah. Sorry. So I'm a little bit sick today, but so yeah, no. I mean, I know exactly what you're asking. For one, I think I'm a big believer in general that the what's it called? What I always kind of put it in my notes once as like the fruit of the tree of knowledge is pretty and tasty. That like knowledge doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's like it's attractive, so to speak, or ugly, whatever it is. Like it's moral, and like it's not. There aren't just facts; they have to do with people,
right,
and feelings, and where people come from. And I think that's always been like a big thing. It's a thing that I believe, and I definitely think in my own life, it's for sure the case. So I think for me, the technical boring answer, I think, is I just have like an obsessive Wikipedia addiction, and in high school, it was probably like someone was like wearing like a t-shirt with a yin yang on it from like Old Navy or something, and I was like, everyone like see it all the time, don't actually know what it means, and it got me kind of a rabbit hole into Daoism and Chinese philosophy more broadly, and I was like a pretty meaning-seeking bit of a hippie high school kid, kind of disillusioned with like a lot of teenage angst about like America and crap. So but instead of getting into, I think, the more typical route that kind of kid gets into, which is like sort of Barnes & Noble Buddhism kind of stuff, I ended up getting more into the Daoist thing. Just totally coincidentally, I don't know, maybe I just wanted to be contrarian and out of the box. So, one thing kind of led to another. In college, I ended up taking a class in East Asian Civ my very first semester, because I'd always been intrigued by stuff that was different rather than learning more about stuff that I already knew. And sort of moving like laterally instead of deeper, I guess you would say. And that kind of got me into really into like Chinese history and Asian history in general. And the two kind of ended up sort of falling in love with the whole culture, history. I took a class in Chinese film. I ended up getting just really intrigued with that kind of thing. And as that was going on, I also got sort of more into postmodernism, and I found that spoke to me a lot, that kind of stuff. I took a class my first semester on Michel Foucault, which was the most pretentious class I've ever taken in college. And I ended up later getting into Rav Shigar from the Jewish side of things. So, I read a lot about the intersection of postmodernism and Jewish thought. And, one thing kind of led to another, and I ended up finding a lot of similarity in postmodernism and Chinese thought, whatever. So that's kind of the more sort of the logistical, like one thing led to another. This is how I got to where I am. Yeah. I think on a personal route, there's I think that people, it really bugged me out for a long time that people that I acted differently in different social contexts. You know what I mean? Like, I think, and I think everybody does it. Like, you act very differently around your parents, I don't know, say like your significant other and like your best friend, or your teachers, and then within each of those, there's subcategories. Sometimes you act differently around different family members. Sometimes you act differently around different people you date. Sometimes you act differently around, like, you have the whole hierarchy of like degrees of how close you are with people. And it really, and that, and it really bugged me out that I wasn't the same person all the time. And I was like, as like a sort of, like I said, it's kind of like an angsty, overthinking, introspective teenager. I think that really led me to a lot of sort of like existential questions of like, just kind of the classic stuff, just like, who am I really, in which of these contexts am I being authentic, and in which am I being phony? Can I be consistent across these? I think I took it for granted that it was like a thing that I wanted to. It was important for me to be the same person across those contexts and figure out which one of me was really, was really me. And I don't think I articulated that so clearly to myself for a long time. I don't think I fully knew that until maybe even like junior year of college, where I was going through like a breakup, and it really I started feeling that very strongly about like this really, like, it came back again, kind of that old question for me of like, who am I really, and why do I act this way? Why do I act differently among different contexts? And like, how can I figure out which one is really me, and who do I really want to be in the future? And I think, and I ended up coming into, especially with Rav Shigar, who I found really answered asked a lot of my questions before answering them. I think just seeing that was really validating and important, and helped me gain a vocabulary to describe it, I think, if that makes sense. And it got me really into the notion of there being different models as like ways of thinking. I became really interested in like cultural relativism, like learning about how that my issues were kind of on a global scale also, that their truth is like kind of manifests differently in different contexts, and that the same thing can appear differently all over the place, and there are different ways of seeing how things change in different contexts as time goes on. That's
fundamental somehow.
Yeah, that was like, that's such a fundamental idea in Chinese philosophy and in postmodernism, and in all these things that I was already into, but was like synthesizing in a more meaningful adult way, I think. And it made kind of, I think, philosophy and mysticism and religion as things that get so abstracted and made pretentious so often, that it was But for me, they've always been like really, really live personal questions. Like they were ways of answering my own kind of personal crisis of like, well,
Wow.
who am I? Who do I want to be? And that kind of thing. And I think I got really interested in, change and presenting things differently in different contexts, and storytelling, and how the story changes depending on different ways of looking at things, and making sense and meaning out of things that don't seem to be able to be made sense or meaning of, and absurdity and nihilism, and all of that stuff. Just kind of, it all sort of came together in those sort of few areas of interest for me, because it's a very personal question of sort of just, it started something very simple, just noticing I was acting differently among different people, and it became really intense and personal, and ended up becoming very enlightening, I think. And I ended up coming with a lot of questioning a lot of my first assumptions and conclusions, and learning a lot of new things. So.
It's really incredible. I mean, because like usually, I mean, like typically with a lot of like intellectual and philosophical journeys, it remains so abstract and it remains so apart from life. But to hear that that these were like questions that were leading you to sort of solutions, and then implementing them, and then finding new ways of being with this new, like it's more than knowledge, it's wisdom, really. It's like,
yeah, exactly. I'm a big believer in I don't think you've there's a good quote by the famous quote by the Kusker Rebbe, where one of his students went over to him and asked him if told him that he'd like finished, that he'd finished the Talmud, he'd like finished Shas, and he went over, and the Kusker Rebbe replied, I think you've heard this, he said you've gone through Shas, but Shas gone through you. Just the notion of I love that quote of, and I'm a big believer in penetrating into the knowledge of what you're doing and getting to the wisdom. And I think if you haven't found yourself in it, then you haven't gone far enough.
wow.
So that's, and I think also like what I know you're interested in, what's we've, already been talking about here, is kind of the relationship between mysticism and rationalism. And I think, or rationalism and a-rational, whatever you want to call it, the other thing, embracing the stuff that doesn't quite make sense. I think that for me, I kind, in my head, like I associate rationalism with the surface level thing, with like the what you would call like the intellectual philosophical journey that's like usually abstracted, that usually kind of happens in that part of the brain or the soul or whatever you want to call it. That's sort of that, like the rational realm. And the other thing, the irrational realm, I think is usually is in the place of wisdom. And that's why I've tended to gravitate toward it in general, because it rings more true. I think there's both in both. You can be really like sort of like sophist and abstracted and philosophical about your mysticism, and you see that plenty of times. And you can be, and plenty of like rational thought is like profoundly meaningful. And I think oftentimes the actual philosophers and thinkers who said it were not, like they weren't saying abstract. They were talking about how they felt about the world. But I think to divorce it from human experience is often how it's read and interpreted. And I think that's always the thing that bugs me out.
It's so interesting, because like the way that you're describing your study and the way that you're like making use and really understanding and implying it is, it seems very contrary to the way that a lot of philosophy is being done today, academically, which is interesting. And I want to get back to that. I mean, I think out of like all the people that I've been interviewing so far, besides for Professor Sarasvati, who's a brilliant, she calls us actually a reluctant scholar. She doesn't like the academia side of academia, but I think you're actually like the most academically like qualified out of any of us, and yet you're like no, that's not the way of thinking.
But I mean, I imagine it.
No, sorry.
I think it's a funny call. I take the compliment. I definitely think being skeptical of your field of interest is only going to make you better at it. And I think one of the I've always been interested in like in knowledge and learning things, but the things have to mean something to you. And I think that this skepticism of the kind of superficial level of knowledge, I think hopefully is something that's going to make me able to be able to teach it better, and to connect to the human side of people better, like in terms of it's not just information, it means something. And I think it's a very live question. And I think one of my problems, I had a rabbi when I was in yeshiva when I was 18, who's Rav Blau, who said, I still love rabbi, but we're still close. But he said to me, he used to make fun of all the time, like the academic world, for saying like, how could it be that like philosophy professors cheat on their wives, you know, or husbands? Like had like how could like the idea of there being like explicit moral transgression, and like the notion of like committed by people who are espousing what should be like deeply ethical and moral things, or not even ethical and moral, just like human you know what I mean?
Right,
Like it's
right.
it's not, but it's just information.
Yeah.
And I think like the way academia kind of puts things in a box is I think it's a really, again, like I think there's a place for rationalism. I think it's like a really important first gesture. Like I think you can't, like you have to kind of put yourself, you have to kind of check yourself at the door a little bit when you were studying something.
Yeah.
But I think if you stop there, then you're, first of all, you're lying to yourself that you checked yourself entirely at the door and that you're studying things. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's not like, if you don't embrace your bias,
sure.
then yeah, like you're a joke of a person. Like you can't actually limit your ego to that extent. And I think that pretending you can only damages your own intellectual enterprise of trying to tell the truth.
Yeah.
Because you claim that you are and you aren't. And I think second of all, you're missing something, which is why I do it then. You know, like why, and like the fact that you're interested in the first place, obviously it must be personal. Like why run away from that?
Unless you're just entertaining like a very small part of your brain, and that's like getting tickled and enjoying the exercise. And it's worth it for that.
And I definitely think there are plenty of people out there who know disrespect to them as people who I think like that's enough for them. Like they're concerned their whole lives with purely intellectual interest. But I do think it can be a shallow way of living.
Yeah. I'm curious. It's so interesting to ask. I'm very new to this whole interviewing thing, and it's such a cool experience to do it, and particularly with friends. But I noticed something interesting in asking people to like say their story in their own words without giving too much like expectation of how I want to hear the story. The way people frame their own narratives is really fascinating. And I'm curious, and a lot of the other framings, I'm just sort of contrasting with what I've heard and with what you've shared. The other framings were very, their religious story played a very, very large part in this story. And I mean, your study was contrasting Rabbi Nachman, and you're quoting the Kotzker. I'm curious to know what your religious story is, and also how that narrative plays into your other narratives.
Yeah, no, totally. So I think I have to think about it for a second. I think.
Sure, take your time.
I think because it's not. I mean, yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm always asking myself and figuring out that question also. So it's like, you know what I mean? Like why am I doing this? Why am I interested in this? And like, where does that play into my religious identity? For sure. I think like I can give you a very like superficial answer, which is like, it occurs to me to say things like, well, a lot of this I've also got out of like Kabbalah, for example, or like Hasidut, right?
A lot of this being
like a lot of these ideas and like this way of making meaning and stuff like that. Like a lot of it comes from Jewish thought, especially like the more mystical side of things
in your own life.
Yeah, exactly. Like just learning Jewish mysticism has been like a tremendous source of insight for me in making sense out of these things, and that's obviously Jewish, right? But I don't know if that's the real reason. You know, like I don't know if it's just like another. I mean, it could be. Like I genuinely don't know, but I'm not sure if it's like the that's like the thing, like that is the like I'm not sure if it's, sorry, the opposite. I meant I'm not sure if that's just another thing that I study that happens to be religious, and that's where my religious identity ties in. I suspect there's something more profound. I think so to kind of go down that route, I think I'm not really sure exactly where this is going to go, but I can say with certainty that I think one of the things that's always bugged me out about God is God's yeah, you know what, I think this is a good kind of way to frame it. I think is that I think I've always found God to be very far away, to and a very much an intellectual abstraction. That's kind of my like natural inclination, but I don't like it. I think that's very comforting for a lot of people, like the notion that like they're not being watched all the time, that they don't have what they consider to be like a more childish conception or something like that. And so because I think that probably would surprise a lot of people who know me well, because I'm very I'm like talk constantly about ideas of like immanence and intimacy and having a relationship with the divine and like all this stuff, and and I'm a musician, I'm a bit of a hippie, like all, you know what I mean? Like that kind of, and I think the idea of like this and I think I got into all that kind of stuff specifically. It took me a long time to kind of get to this, get to this realization. But I think the whole reason I'm into those kinds of things is because they are ways of overcoming what I kind of feel often is that like essential distance. And I think that all of those things brought me to the more sort of irrational mystical side of things. I think like all of the frustration with the distance, I found like understanding God as like kind of this intellectual abstraction. It made me really realize that like people aren't machines, and you can't think things and then feel them. You don't arrive at necessarily. It's one way to thoughts are one way to feelings. Like I said, there's always a place for rationalism, but I think going straight to feelings is like a tremendously important thing for people to do and learn about themselves. And I think that's been that for me was like a huge religious awakening. The notion that like I can kind of just, that there were certain problems that I wouldn't be able to think my way out of, and that I would feel like I had a stronger Jewish identity, a stronger connection to God, a more meaningful life, better relationships, like all this, like it was all tied together for me if I could kind of cut to the core and like skirt around the brain problem and get straight to the heart. And I think that's more that kind of like pre-intellectual language is much more the realm of mysticism, of postmodernism. It's a lot of the stuff, like Daoism is talking, at least ancient kind of philosophers were like thinking about a lot. Yeah, I think does that make sense? Just kind of vaguely answer the question.
Yeah, it's firstly, it's really fascinating to see you like formulate it like in action. It's really cool.
Yeah.
And also it's so interesting. I'm just like reflecting on it's so interesting like to ask about religion and to hear back about God. On the one hand, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because of course, but then on the other hand, it's like, who talks about God when they pose a question about religion? It's like religion.
Which is hilarious. Yeah. Like, I mean, to me, again, it's the core of the issue, like why pretend?
it's almost, I mean, it seems like you have this like this like, I don't know, like this drive to like get to like not be satisfied with the surround and the fluff and the
yeah. I mean, to be fair, I think Jewish identity is a tremendous part of it. I don't think it's my intuition to answer about identity when you say that. But for me, like it was enough. I mean, that's part of the kind of what I said in the beginning about like I was kind of had this like teenage that I still have, but like this sort of teenage, probably lifelong crisis of like, well, who am I? Different kind. You know what I mean? I think well, to what extent am I Jewish, and when, where, and with who am I Jewish was also a big part of it. That was you know what I mean? So it's it's a more local way of looking at things. It's not like it's like one of a few different identities that I have that I was really bugging out about.
Sure.
But that was part of it for me, was having nothing to do with God, just the sense of like the fact that I feel Jewish sometimes and not other times was, or like even something as simple as like in college I'd go to the Beit Midrash and study like Jewish texts in college, and then I would leave in like a very religious, what you might call like more conservative context, and then I would leave to like go out to Boston with friends, and it would then like grab drinks, and like it really freaked me out. I was like, am I doing something wrong? And it wasn't quite guilt as much as like a sense of like internal contradiction, and like I liked both sides of me, and I didn't really know how to do that. Am I not Jewish in the bar? Am I, you know what I mean? Like it's like that was that was a piece of it, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely something I can relate to a lot. That sense of sort of split identity and like this almost like the schizophrenia. It's like which am I? Who am I? I'm curious. Did you grow up in a religious community, in a religious neighborhood?
I grew up in a pretty typical what you would call typical modern Orthodox kind of I don't know, middle American upbringing, whatever. I like grew up in Skokie, Illinois. In a like went to a Jewish day school my whole life. Never really particularly liked it. Wouldn't say I was like proud to be Jewish in terms of the Jewish identity question, and I wouldn't say that I had such a profound, meaningful connection or just understanding of, or thinking about God that constantly from that angle. So from both the identity piece and the God piece of it, I think I wasn't really so necessarily stimulated, but it was definitely my life.
How did you encounter Jewish mysticism growing up in a modern Orthodox community, which is
Yeah, so I didn't. Is the short answer. It wasn't something I got into until I didn't even realize that it was really an option. Like I think like Hasidim were basically just people who wore suits and hats until I was really in yeshiva, till I took my gap year after high school before college in Jerusalem, and was sort of introduced much more specifically first to like the world of Hasidism and to the world of also Rav Kook, the like the Israeli Jewish mystic, and before I got into that stuff, I didn't really know. Again, like I was kind of saying before, like sort of any other kind of vaguely hippie, angsty, thoughtful teenager, I was like much more drawn to like the Chinese, the Asian thing, which I still am, is a big part of my identity and I'm fascinated by. But I wasn't even aware that there was a Jewish corollary. It wasn't even a thing for me to look into.
Wow.
Like I wasn't really aware that there was like a Jewish mystical counterpart to that stuff. Yeah, and then and in Orayta, in my gap year program in the yeshiva, I was like more introduced to that kind of stuff, and I was like, and I don't think I connected it for a while. That I was like, oh, this is the Jewish version. I didn't even articulate until literally I think it was like this past summer, it like dawned on me. It's like blaringly obvious epiphany that like every culture has their mystics, and like the Hasidim are the Jewish mystics. Like they are like the Rebbe is the Jewish Dalai Lama. Like they're, you know what I mean? Like it's and it was like such an obvious formula, like thing to say and thing to think, but it just never occurred to me that like we all every culture has theirs.
Right.
Like the like the Chinese, the Arabs, the Indians, like the like all of those people are like very old groups of people, and they all have like politicians and writers and thinkers and philosophers and mystics, and like that's who ours are. And it just like never occurred to me to even frame it like that, which is so funny. Like I always thought it was this different thing, but it's, you know what I mean?
What was that realization like for you?
It was funny. It was definitely a funny thought. I think I laughed out loud when I realized it, because it was just the sense of like, it was like the sense of like, do you think you're so different than other people? And it's not selfish or arrogant, but everybody just kind of has this exceptionalist identity that like I study everyone else, but I myself don't really fit into anyone's categories. And it was this very kind of like weird, almost an alienating, a little uncomfortable. It was like funny, like it wasn't like a huge identity crisis, but it was like a little uncomfortable realization that like, wait a second, like this thing that I thought was like mine is really just like everyone has theirs. And it was like this sense of like, the way I was putting this recently so I was, working actually back at Orayta, my gap year program this past year as a madrich, as like a dorm counselor, and I was teaching a weekly class. And one of the things I was saying to my kids is I was kind of trying to teach them about that idea of like self-alienation kind of. And which I think is the thing like most, if not all 18-year-olds are familiar with, if not just like don't have the,
vocabulary. Right.
Yeah, exactly. So, words are everything. So I was kind of trying to like frame it. And I was like, and I said like, and I'm very big into making things like every day, like this, again, like to getting to like, you really feel this in your life. It's not just intellectual abstraction. So the way I was trying to teach it was like, that feeling you have, and like you have a house, and when you're a kid, there's like your home is only home and everyone else's home is just like a foreign place, and then you go to someone else's house and you spend enough time. And like when you're a kid, you go to someone else's, it's just like it's just like, it's not your home. Like it's not comfortable, and it's like, that's fine, because only your home is real and everyone else's home is just like a movie set, that like disappears when you leave. And then you have this like weird realization when you're, I don't know how old, but maybe like 13, 14 even, like when you go over to someone's house, and it's this like very weird, mature thought of like, wow, like the way I feel about my house is the way this guy feels about his house. And like, that means that the way I feel about his house is the way he feels about my house.
Yeah.
Like that's scary. Like it's this weird thought where like you kind of you go back to your like dining room and you're like looking around at dinner, and you're like sort of free, you're like looking around and you're like, well, this feels like so, like I'm trying to picture how it would look to an outsider, and you feel very like cut out from you know what I mean? And it's a very strange sense.
Yeah.
So I think so the thought I had when I realized that like Jewish, you know what I mean? Like I always thought like the Hasidim and like Kabbalah and all that stuff was like a special Jewish thing that like, even if I didn't like it or had nothing to do with my life, I was like, so it's there for me if I want to get in touch with my culture and heritage. It's like a special thing that my tradition offers. And then I realized like, well, yeah, true. Like it's only existent in Torah, and I think in Jewish culture, but like there's a mysticism in every culture. And that was like a very self-alien, because I realized I was like, oh, wait a second. Like when I like academically study, or even forget academic, whatever, when I'm just like in bed at night reading a book about Daoism, and it's just like an interesting thing that I can pick and choose whether I want to make a part of my life or not. Like, that's just what Kabbalah is. And that was like a very weird, alienating thought. You know, it was like a funny but unpleasant realization.
Wow, that's so fascinating. I had the same childhood experience, not with my home, but the first time I flew overseas. Like, most of my family lives in the States, and I was living in Australia, so we would go and visit. And when I realized that there were like actually other countries with like like there was like a whole China with like Chinese people with their own language, and their lives like didn't like my life wasn't implicit in their lives, and like my life didn't make a difference to them.
Right, totally. Yeah, it's very weird. It's like very like, and you know what I mean? And like, and I think like the childish way of putting it, you know, is like, oh, like the streets are only pretty in my hometown, but they're not pretty anywhere else. And it's like, well, the streets are only pretty because you're familiar with them.
Yeah.
And that's a very sobering, kind of scary realization that that everything you sort of hold dear about reality is very postmodern realization. I think it's like everything you realize about your reality is like arbitrary. It's yours. It's not factual. It's just yours.
Yes.
Which is like some kind of beautiful, but also kind of depressing. Like, it's sort of, you know, it was definitely a strange realization. I think also it's funny, like language, I think, is a really good example of this, is when you, and I know a lot of, you know, like postmodern philosophers speak about like language is a huge hot button topic for both mysticism and philosophy, and I think one of the reasons why is like this, you have this weird kind of like, you never really know what grammar is when you're growing up, when English is your first language, and you grow up and you don't really have a concept of like nouns, verbs, and adjectives. You just kind of know how to speak. And then you probably learned about nouns, verbs, and adjectives in a foreign language you learned in school or growing up, whether it was Hebrew, Spanish, French, Chinese, God knows, whatever. And then it probably took you like several years to realize that your own language had those things, which is like funny because you already had the vocabulary to self-analyze, but you just didn't do it.
Right.
Like it's so not a natural human instinct to be in exile from yourself, to be outside of yourself, and to think that about home, about your literal language, about your cultural language, about your personal emotional language is a very weird thing to think. And that's a lot of the kind of thoughts that I was having in starting in, I think, in high school, in the sense of like, well, I'm different in different and it was like, well, which one of these is authentic? Which one is the one that I don't? It's almost a weird litmus test of like, I don't think it's healthy to necessarily be obsessed with this question, but like it's almost a weird litmus test of like, who's the real you? Is like, what's the one that I question the least? What's the one that I don't analyze the most? You know what I mean? Like, what's my first language? Like, it's
which is like the default, the base model. I'm just to for me to get a clear understanding of the timeline here. So you write your honors paper in Brandeis on Rabbi Nachman and Zhuangzi, which I had a chance of reading a while back, a few months ago when we first met, which was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And the Orayta came after that with your, or
well, it was both. That's the confusing part. Yeah, it was my gap program when I was 18 before college.
Okay.
And then I returned when I made Aliyah, when I moved to Israel last year, like last August, this past August. I moved back and I went back to Orayta to work for the interim, for the previous. Well, I was only there for about 6-7 months before this whole disaster hit, so I've been in Chicago since. But so I went back, and then I went back as like a dorm counselor, and I was like teaching classes a couple times a week and hanging out with the kids all the time and doing this kind of thing.
Very cool. And you were writing on the side as well. I saw I think the first thing I saw from you was something that you had written for
Lair House.
For Lair House, yeah.
Yeah.
Which I think was also a fantastic article about
thanks.
Sort of bringing pathos and bringing meaning back to otherwise what becomes a very empty Jewish life of
like
sort of
straying away from
endless,
or at least using intellectual abstractions only as like kind of a waiting room for the other thing, for the deeper thing.
That, like, from the second I read that piece, I was like, I need to know this guy. Like, there's no doubt about it. So you grow up mono-Orthodox. You don't hear much about Jewish mysticism or mysticism in general. You encounter Chinese culture, and with that Chinese thought and Chinese mysticism, let's say, and then you come to Israel and you discover Jewish mysticism, and then you take that back with you to Brandeis, and you get the tools to analyze and compare and contrast those traditions. Is that a fair sketch?
Yeah. A big part of my thesis was figuring out my methodology. I spent about a month thinking about it and talking to my thesis advisor and that kind of thing about what my methodology was going to be, comparing and contrasting. Because there's a lot of ways to do it. I don't know that much about comparative philosophy or religion, which is kind of a shtick because it's what I did for 9 months my senior year. I was like pretty amateurish. about it, but my impression is there's a real like very like I think the field is very cognizant of different ways of doing it.
Sure.
And there's like a few different methods of comparing
Right.
ways of thinking and just different stuff. And I think so. I don't know, which ism or which branch I fit into. I think, but for me, it's been very important. I think it's really easy to say how two things are similar, and it's really easy to say how two things are alike.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think it's very it's really like anyone can go on like I don't know like point out that like that two religions like both touch on the idea, like they both say things like I don't know like death is liberating, and like from there you see they had a common root, right? And it's like or like you like you see like this is a basic truth that everybody has, and I think those are very easy claims to make because it's very hard to find. Me and my friend have a game we play where we try to come up with two things that have nothing to do with each other at all. Like we'll just go over, we'll be like dolphins and World War II, and like,
and then someone has to prove how they're actually related.
Yeah, exactly. It's like really, and it's really hard. You know what I mean? It's like really like find commonalities is so easy. So, and I think, yeah, that game's a good time. But it's a funny human is like you can. It's like you really have to outthink yourself. Like your natural inclination is to find. So anyway, yeah. And I think it's also very easy to point out because no two things are obviously the same thing. Like very few, most things do not equal like other things. Right. Is that so it's very easy to point out differences, and I think the tough thing that I had a really fun time with in my thesis was and that I think about a lot is this bit like the finding this the space that the two ways of thinking have in common, and then kind of delving in a little bit further and being like, okay, how are in the area that these two have in common, where are the differences? And that's when you can really isolate what makes each thing special. I think is like you can really tell. Like for me, it was like I found that the Rabbi Nachman or Zhuangzi, this Hasidic, early 19th century like Polish thinker, and this and this like ancient Chinese thinker from like 300 BCE, were like they was thinking it was like crazy how much they had in common in terms of like rejecting rationalism in a lot of ways and embracing it in really interesting counterintuitive ways and their ideas of like nothingness and all this stuff. But they and yet there were really, really, really different things about them. And when I could pinpoint that, it helped me kind of the space between the differences and the commonalities was really helped me identify what makes someone Jewish and what makes someone Daoist or Chinese. That was really like, so I think you can pinpoint something about someone's identity when you see what they have in common and different with someone else, and you kind of put it together or look in between, like in between the cracks kind of. So that was a fun and interesting realization. I think about that a lot.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I've had a similar experience where in the beginning I was very enamored by all the similarities, and I was just like totally blown away, and finding new similarities was like just finding like nuggets of gold. And then it reaches a point where the similarities are so abundant and ubiquitous. It's just like they're no longer really that interesting. It's like you just expect to see them, and then it's finding differences inside of those similarities, like you said,
exactly,
which really sheds so much light and really point to like such a deep like psychological,
it's also like it's
place.
the way I think about it sometimes is like when somebody points out, it's like like people would freak out sometimes when I was it's like sometimes I'll be talking about stuff and you'll find two thinkers that have something in common, and people will freak out. Like your friend will be like, "Oh my God, it's crazy! Like they're the same thing," and you're like, "Well, but they're not. Like, like why aren't they? You know what I mean? Like why is this not like every once in a while it really is genuinely crazy. Like you read a source and you don't know where it's from and you think it's from one place and it turns out to be from halfway around the world 2,000 years ago, and like that really is like you're like, oh, I genuinely thought this came from a different culture. But usually it's like you can read if you're not looking carefully. You read Rabbi Nachman or Zhuangzi or whoever it is, and you be like, well, but I can clearly tell which one's Jewish and which one's Chinese. Like why? So I kind of try to stop and ask myself the question of like, well, why that? Like why is it that in spite of all their commonalities, it's still easy for me to tell them apart? And like that's the area I think where you really like that's like the magic, the sweet spot kind of.
I want to ask you more about the thesis. I want you to share it with the audience, but I wonder if you brought that back to your own quandary of sort of difference and similarity between your own identities, where you're starting to appreciate the different views that emerge in different scenarios.
In I think Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of hit it on the head. For me, and this is a very Jewish idea. That this is this is a tangent, but I think it's a good one. That I think that I think all the time that like I bug out all the time if I'm like kind of academifying, like putting in a box my Jewish identity, and if that's just one, like I ask myself that all the time. I'm not, and it doesn't necessarily bother me. I just wonder often if like am I like a lot of things, one of which is Jewish, or is there something really core Jewish about me that underlines everything else? And I think about that a lot. And and it's funny because as much as I'm like afraid sometimes that it's like it's that there's not that much Jewish about me. It's just one thing I'm into. Sometimes I seem to not be able to escape it. And one example of that I think is it's a very Jewish idea, that like the conception of God. And this is a good kind of my thought and practice, I think, of how it's not just intellectual, it's very personal for me. But I think like there's this abstract idea that's very intellectual and not really specifically relevant to anybody necessarily, is in Kabbalah, this idea that like there's kind of this ineffable God, right? And he's like a big oneness divorced from reality, without any features, without a face, without a body. And then and he manifests in a lot of different ways. And each one of those things, it's like it's a singular prism. It's like one color of the rainbow, and you can't see the whole rainbow. That's not like in human capacity. Like it's a thing that's much bigger, but when it comes down to earth, it has to take one form, and the form necessarily is partial, right? It's like you're looking at light through a painted glass window, is one way my Rosh Yeshiva, David Aaron, one of the rabbis at Orayta, teaches a lot. And you change whatever the glass is going to affect the light that comes through. And there's no way to see pure light from inside. And I think that's a very abstract, cool, but not necessarily personal idea.
Right.
But I think for me, I kind of had a sense, and by the way, that's not necessarily true in Zhuangzi's thought, for example, and in a lot of postmodernism. There's not really, right? Postmodernism is all like the death of the narrative. There is nothing at the center. There is no light. There is nothing behind the painting. What
Right.
you're seeing is the glass itself.
Yes.
And I think that so that's one way of conceiving of my identity, which is there is no real me.
Yes.
There's just a bunch of different me's, and that's fine.
Yeah.
That freaks people out a lot, and
Yeah.
understandably.
Yeah.
But I think what I think about a lot is that there's a me that's a conglomerate of all of the individual me's that can't exist at one time. It's like up there. It's not. It's like a very abstract kind of useless, meaningless me that, like in theory, is there. Like there's a me, right? But it's not. But it has to go somewhere. I have to talk to someone, words have to come out of my mouth, and I have to have a conversation with you. Right. And the way we have that conversation is going to be the product of like our personal histories, how I feel about you, if we're comfortable, what we're comfortable talking about, like how I the I don't know, like your gender, if we're related, like all, like I think those are all really big deals.
Yeah.
And I think, and they change, so to speak, like in Kabbalah, it's like the sphira, right? Like almost like a body part that manifests the aspect of the divine. And I think like the aspect of me that's showing up is different. And I think so, like it's a very Jewish idea that helped me, to your original question, to kind of circle back, kind of make sense about like this different, like what all of those parts of me had in common is a clear sort of a deference, I guess you would say, to the whole me, the first thing, right? That they all, like, one way I answered the question once, and I was like bugging out that like I acted so differently around different people, was like, well, all of those people, if they got in a room together without me and they talked about me, they'd all clearly be talking about the same person. Like it's pretty rare. I don't think there'd be any more than maybe one or two people in the room, which is like, I don't know, like a car salesman that I talked to one time from 5 years ago who like didn't know me at all, who would like genuinely be like, wow, that sounds like a totally different person. Like they all, what I mean? Like it's like you think you're so different among different people, but there's something that binds them. That's the commonality.
Right. There would be a family resemblance amongst them.
Exactly. Yeah. And like among the different yous. Yeah. And I think that so that's the commonality, right? That they all owe their sort of allegiance to this one kind of united capital Y you, capital I me, whatever it is. And but on the other hand, in terms of the difference thing, that they're all clearly, people know parts of you, and you're manifesting differently in different contexts.
Right.
That was one way I kind of made sense out of it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's so great to see someone take like a very all traditional language and reapply it in a way that's very meaningful. And I wonder, I mean, I think the Kabbalists may have had this identity crisis in reverse, where they were trying to make sense of God, and they'll be like, oh, we can't get the whole thing. But if we could sort of grab God a bit as Chachman, a bit as Binnen, a bit as Malchus, and a bit as this, then maybe we can kind
and
of
we'll be able to get to the root.
to piece together like what is the capital I that stands behind them.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know that that's so different. Also, I think that you have relationships with other people, and you have a relationship with God, and you have a relation, which is, so to speak, another person, and you have relationships with yourself, and you are another to yourself. You're constantly trying to figure out yourself. And I think relationships for me are really kind of the ultimate metaphor of making sense, or I don't know, system for like making sense out of things. And when you're in a relationship, you start with like, I don't know, like let's say a little relationship, like you go on a first date and you get like a whiff of a person, you get like one sphere, like one way they manifest themselves. And it might be so bad that it's not worth finding out about the other parts. But I think it's wrong to think that if you don't like, you don't really know the person, like you have to kind of like, when like you're fleshing them out, you're learning, you're seeing how they manifest in different contexts. And I think often, did you watch Malcolm in the Middle?
No.
You're a kid. There's a great TV show, like Frankie Muniz as a little kid. There's a great one of the it's just like a sitcom, and there's like a show that I love. And his mom is this like insanely, just about like him growing up, and his brother's being like a middle child, heads in the middle. But his mom is like this just this whacked out, super controlling, like domineering, screams all the time, like totally obsessive, like caricature of like a overprotective mother. And there's a great episode and she just like runs the house and they're all terrified of her. And there's a great episode, it's like a couple seasons in, where he goes to visit her at work, and she's like a cashier, like a supermarket, and she's like so submissive and like totally like, and she's like coming in and she's like, sure, whatever, go, like, you know what I mean, like if you want to do it. And he's like what, like he's like totally freaking out. And I think, and it's such a trope that like people know about like you meet your boss outside of work or whatever it is, and like I think when you're dating someone also, like it's when you're in a relationship with somebody, you like oftentimes even years down the line, you don't see certain parts of them. And those parts are also the partial representations of stuff. Like you learn something, not just about, it's not a reason like, oh, I didn't know you act that way. It's like, that doesn't really matter. But when you learn about how someone acts in a way that you didn't know, you learn something that's deeper about who they are inside. Right. You learn that they have submissiveness in them.
Yes.
Or like they learn something, just like you learn something that's behind that. Yes. And I think that you do that. And I think that that's, to your point, I think that's exactly what the Kabbalists were trying to do with God. That I think that they were trying to figure out how to have a relationship with someone who they didn't really know at all. And there was this sense of like, okay, well, we have to figure out all of the parts, and then what's behind them will be implied. Right. And I think that you also have a relationship with yourself. I think that you figure out like, who am I? Well, you say, okay, well, let me see the different parts of me. Let me kind of, you're doing the same thing. And I think, and to really, I don't know, this blows my own mind, was this realization, was the thought that I know you're really into Chabad Hasidut, and in Chabad there's a big idea of in Kabbalah in general, but especially in Chabad, this idea that the neshama, the soul, is a chelek elo amimal, is like a small little piece of God. And the suggestion that what you're doing with God is what you're doing with yourself. Yeah. It's not like a metaphor or an analogy. It's like the same thing. Yes. Figuring out who you are and figuring out God. Like, I think that's what the Kabbalists were trying to do. They were in the language that they knew how of, before 20th century post-enlightenment self-awareness, they were asking, 800 years ago, questions of, like, they were having my teenage identity crisis. They were like, who is God really? Who am I really? And how can I figure it out?
Yeah. The maxim that was above the gateway at Delphi, know thyself.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Like the in Greek, when by the oracles of Delphi. So know thyself was above the gateway, and many later mystics, Neoplatonistic mystics, Gnostics, Islamic mystics, took this line and they appended like another part of the sentence, which is know thyself and thou shalt know God.
That's cool.
That idea of self-discovery and discovery of God are one and the same.
Yeah, exactly. And the reverse is true also, that I think what the Kabbalists were doing was trying to know God in order to know themselves.
They're trying to reverse engineer the process.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's really interesting. It's funny, the metaphor of relationship, which you bring up, is a really interesting one. And it could be that we like fundamentally think very differently about this, but I think the flip side to the So sort of the idea that there's this transcendent God who can only manifest partially in the Sefirot is definitely one aspect in Kabbalistic thought. But the Kabbalists, being monotheists, can't say that there's really one God up there and then there's like some other lesser God that's manifesting. So the Kabbalists will often say, like in Aramaic, that God and his garments, God and his life force, the Sefirot essentially are one. And because of God's indivisibility, they'll have to say that in every sort of aspect of manifestation, in that point of manifestation, as much as it's removed from the essential sort of Ein Sof God, you'll find the totality of God there as well. And I was thinking, like in relationships, like you go on a first date with someone, and in that split second of a first impression, you'll know nothing, but you'll also know everything simultaneously. And 50 years later in marriage, I haven't been in a marriage for 50 years, but I feel like still that first moment will encapsulate the essence of the person.
I mean, I think it's also true, right? That context will, like, the more you know that person, the more you'll understand how much they were in their first interaction.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? Like, it's like knowing somebody, and even something as simple as, like, I think to use a really cheesy kind of romantic example of like the way someone laughs, right? Like, I think that like if someone laughs at a joke you make on a first date, and then and it's like a funny laugh that's like kind of weird, and like you notice it, it's like a funny quirky thing, but then like 30 years down the line, where like that person, like you understand exactly what they found funny about it the first time. And like I think it is true that the totality is in the point, but I think that until you know the totality, it's not necessarily so
appreciate that. Interesting. And I think this goes to like a very core like dialectic in mysticism in general, like the all and the nothing. I want to ask you about your thesis, and I was wondering if you would be generous enough to outline your thesis.
For sure. I haven't talked about it in a bit, but it's always fun to revisit it. So I said a few times, I compared this guy Zhuangzi to the ancient Chinese Daoist figure, to Rabbi Nachman. I think what I kind of put in the intro that I sort of liked was there's like a traditional Chinese saying. I never was able to find it in Chinese or track it down, or who said it, or where it comes from, or anything like that. But there's a lot of different versions of it, I think. But it's basically something like basically Daoism and Confucianism are kind of the two sort of representatives of the biggest strains in China, which is like the more mystical thing, the more rational thing. And Buddhism is a huge part of China's identity also. It gets lumped in more with Daoism, but it shows up in both, whatever it is. But basically it kind of stand-ins for like those two, for the brain and the heart, I guess you would say. And it's sort of in Western terms. And so they're usually conceived of as being opposites and as fighting frequently. But of course, Lama says it happens in action. They frequently are complementing each other in Chinese history, which is a shtick also, because like I was mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, I think rationalism excludes everything else, but mysticism, or the other thing, includes rationalism. So I think the idea of yin yang is this idea that things are things are complementary, not opposite, and that a thing always implies its complement.
Yes.
So I think Daoism itself could have told you that it would work with Confucianism, whereas Confucianism denied that. But anyway, there's an
I like that you said that the thing always implies its complement as opposed to its opposite.
It's opposite. Yeah.
It's a very nice.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So that's very Daoist way of putting things, I think. So there's been traditionally what actually happened. The saying is like something like a man is something like, it's like a Confucian in his place of work and a Daoist in his home, or a Daoist when he retires, or I think there's a few different versions, something like that. And I always really loved that idea, and was introduced kind of to that idea of complementarity sort of counterintuitively, where you would think that they're just making fun of each other constantly. I think that when I was introduced to that idea in the Chinese thought before, I realized how much of a thing it is in Jewish thought, consciously, right? The Jewish thinkers talk all the time about the relationship between rationalism and mysticism. And so I decided that comparing one of the reasons I wanted to compare Rabbi Nachman and Zhuangzi was because I thought they were the two maybe best representatives of that line of thought in both traditions. And that there's a bit of research into the relationship between Confucianism and halacha and Jewish law,
One second.
I haven't.
That line of thought being the complementarity of the mystical and the rational.
In theory, yeah.
Okay.
I was like, not even before I was getting into that, I was just like thinking of just the what's it called? I just wanted to just compare like the irrational part of both traditions. Like there's been a bit of research in like just scholarship and whatever that means into between Jewish law and Confucianism. Not so much like rationalist thinkers and Confucian thinkers, but there has been a relationship between kind of the more kind of technical, pragmatic side of things in Confucian thought, but there hasn't really been any. So when it comes to comparing Jewish and Chinese thought, people found like the brain and compared the brain in each tradition, but they never really compared like the heart in each tradition. I didn't really find anything on that, oddly enough. So I decided that I wanted to, and it was just two thinkers that had made a big difference in my own life. So I decided to compare the two, and that was kind of where it started from, was trying to compare like the irrational side of Chinese and Jewish thought and pick a thinker that like best represents it. And I talked specifically about the idea of knowledge and how they both think of knowledge.
Can I pause you and ask for some definitions?
Yeah, totally.
Define for me, in the way that you're using them, rationality and irrationality.
Yeah, so I think that was so I think rational thought is kind of what we've been talking about as sort of the academic gesture, like the when you take something and you want to put it in a box and check yourself at the door and study it in a way that, and it's also logical, right? It uses reason. It makes sense. I think a big part of maybe I never studied, like I was helping my sister with her symbolic logic homework the other day after she was like teaching me what she was learning herself. So like, I don't really, I never, besides that for, 2 hours, I never like formally studied symbolic logic or haven't read too much Kant or anything like this. But it seems to me that maybe the underlying principle of logic itself is the notion of self-consistency. So the notion of having to make things consistent, resolving contradictions, figuring out cause and effect and explanations. And I think that whole wave of approaching the world and bias is usually conceived to be an obstacle to that. And I think that that whole way of looking at the world is kind of what I'm calling rationalism. And I think not necessarily mysticism is a form of irrationalism, I think, but kind of which I don't know if that's like a real, there's a formal definition for irrationalism or anything, but irrationalism is kind of like, to me, is kind of like, it's the other way of thinking. It's the way of thinking that kind of embraces biases, that embraces the regular contradictions of life, that embraces the limitation of human knowledge, as like you can interact with the world, and frequently we do interact with the world despite the fact that we don't know anything about it. So it's trying to like tap into that part of the brain or the heart that's allowing you to do that, right? Because logic dictates you shouldn't be able to do things that you don't understand, and yet all the time we do. So how can that be? And I think that that whole body of tools that allows us to do that is like irrational thought. And I think that some thinkers are afraid of it and try to conquer chaos of life, and some thinkers try more to embrace it and view it as like a mode of living. And I think there's a good quote in the Zhuangzi at the beginning of one of the earlier chapters that's like, knowledge is limitless. The human capacity for knowledge is finite. To use what is finite to pursue what is limitless is dangerous, which is a quote I always liked. That dangerous. The attempt, yeah, exactly. That the attempt to use the mind, which can understand very realistically very little of what you interact with every day, to use that as kind of your main point of entry into the world isn't going to get you very far.
Right.
So I think, so is that,
no, that's a really,
that a good,
that's a really beautiful and succinct definition. So to bring you back to your thesis, so you were looking at knowledge,
the irrational thinker and how they conceived of knowledge, which is something we usually it sounds kind of crazy also at first, like it's like something knowledge seems to inherently mean something that's logical, and so you know what I mean, how can you know something without logically making sense of it? So what I wanted to do was basically answer that question and figure out what the kind of the heart rather than the brain of the Chinese and the Jewish traditions, two things that have probably the two traditions that have most influenced my own life. to kind of pick stand-ins for those two traditions, and see what they had to say and see what makes. I wasn't really going out with this intention, but finding out what makes one Chinese, what makes one Jewish, what are the basic human insights that they both have to teach, and that was kind of that was sort of what happened. So I basically, so the thesis was it was an intro and 3 chapters. The intro was basically just historical context, which is interesting in itself, but for another time, I think. There basically were kind of 3 chapters where I fleshed it out. So the first chapter was about other ways of knowing. It was a critique of basically kind of what I just said to you, of like how the problems of logic and the intellect, and how they can't necessarily make sense of the world, and how for both thinkers there's other ways of understanding things, I can use sort of brief examples from both. Is that Zhuangzi frequently speaks about the term in Chinese is Ming, which means it's like it's frequently used in phrases to mean knowledge, but not in an intellectual sense. It actually literally means light. It means like insight. You kind of would say, or like illumination.
Got it.
And Zhuangzi uses the phrase Ming all the time to mean some kind of like intuition, is how you see it translated a lot. Is that he thinks of life as because knowledge interferes with your way of living, you should actually deliberately get rid of it and live what he puts as like a fish in water. Like you should just essentially just trust your gut, is kind of a simplistic way of putting it, that you can actually cultivate a way of living where you're constantly living on intuition, and relying on your instincts, and you can actually cultivate your instincts and your intuition rather than going through every situation and feeling like, how can I make the best decision? Being like, stop thinking about the decision. You already know what the best thing to do is, and you're going to make a wrong decision. You're more likely to make a wrong decision the more you analyze it and move away from your intuition.
Sound advice.
Very sound advice. Yeah. So he was really into embracing that way of living.
And what's that term again?
Ming means
okay.
is one phrase he used. He doesn't only use that phrase, but it's a good kind of succinct way. It's like that's his term for that kind of way of living, or one term he uses. And Zhuangzi is also in that chapter. I talked more about kind of their disparaging remarks about the intellect. How Zhuangzi is very into the famous kind of among a very niche group, but sort of famous phrase that he uses called "zuowan," which means sitting and forgetting. He actually he wanted you to literally sit and forget things and ways of thinking about the world and systems of knowledge, so you can, as a way of cultivating this intuition, as almost like a meditative practice. Like you should literally sit and forget. And Rabbi Nachman, for his part, was also wrote a lot about kind of more like the very first piece in his magnum opus in Likutei Moharan. He talks about getting to the seichel of things, which means like the intellect of things, which is a really funny word to use because he doesn't really seem to be saying anything intellectual. And I think he's probably doing it on purpose. He's kind of sort of subverting your traditional notion of what it means to know and understand something. That seichel seems to me, it's similar to kind of intuition. It's like getting to the core aspect. Bechina is a word he uses a lot, right? It's like getting to the core nature of something, past the kind of description of it or the report intellectually of what someone tells you it might be. And I think it's the same thing as like it's kind of like when you're acting with a cashier or a lawyer, or even a peer sometimes. Like those are all kind of almost not literally, right, but like capital letter words that like they cast someone in a role in your life. I think one of the issues I think with like I think it's human nature also one of the issues, especially like a capitalist society, right, is it really casts people in roles and you relate to people completely as one thing, as how they relate to you. And I think Rabbi Nachman was kind of asking you to get past it and get to the point where, okay, but who's the person? Where's like the humanity, the part that you can't, conquer or stick in a box, the part that, yeah, exactly. And that's not a logical thing. It can't be properly explained, that sensation of real intimacy and connection. Right. And I think that's what he was often asking you to have, and saw the intellect as an obstacle too. So the first chapter was kind of like an exploration of how, of the irrational way of understanding the world and how rationalism gets in the way. The second chapter, moving past that, was like a way of was kind of the other side of the coin, which is, okay, if rationalism is wrong and it doesn't really represent the way the world really is, then there's a really interesting side effect, which is you can play with, like, if all kind of facts are sort of made up, then you can play with facts to get what you want.
Okay.
Which is like very interesting. So Zhuangzi does this, not as much in the Zhuangzi because he's more skeptical of the intellect, but he does sometimes. He'll argue with people and he'll use their own arguments against them. And he doesn't even believe in the kind of argument they're making. So there's probably one of the more, again, it's super, pretty niche community, but like one of the more famous sections of the Zhuangzi, he's in a conversation with his Huisha, who's kind of sort of like a Rambam, Maimonides, sort of overly comically rationalist figure. He kind of sort of makes into a bit of a joker. And he's talking to Huisha, and they're standing over a river, and Zhuangzi looks over the river, and he says, oh, look at all the fish. The fish are so happy to be in the river. That's what fish really love, is being happy in the river. And Huisha says, you're not a fish, so how do you know what fish really love? And Zhuangzi replies, you're not me, so how did you know that I don't know what fish really love? Which is like deliberately funny. Like it's like the only ancient book that like I laugh reading, but it's like his point, right? He's using, and then there's a great argument where Huisha replies, and Zhuangzi kind of dismisses him. He says, all right, what were you asked in the beginning? Let's go to your first point. You want to know how I really thought about it? And he answers, different conversation, but the point is, it's funny that he uses his opponent's argument against him, and then says he didn't even believe in the own argument. He has his own, like, he knows why fish are happy, and he explains it.
Right.
But he's able to, and you don't see Huisha being this kind of smart aleck guy who's able to use Zhuangzi's arguments against him, right? Like, because Zhuangzi doesn't really think that any one way of representing the world is true. There's change. You have to use different models of representing the world as they see fit. Is rather than embracing a single one. You can use your opponent's argument against him. You can mess with the facts of the world frequently, right? Like, you can be an intellectual where it suits you, and you can be anti-intellectual in other situations, right? That you can be different people in different contexts. And there's not only is there nothing wrong with that, there's something wrong with being consistent. And Rabbi Nachman, for his part, also would frequently speak about it. I don't think he necessarily do it himself. Like, I don't know if we have like stories of him like using different intellectual models, but all throughout his like mystical thoughts in the Likutei Moharan especially, he talks about these ideas of like, you kind of like using different models. One really beautiful way that I put it, right, is, like in Hebrew you have otiyot and nikutot, you have letters and the vowels, and in Hebrew the vowels aren't letters themselves, they're just symbols. So because of that, you can write the letters with or without the vowels. And the way he puts it is, you can vowelize words differently. Is you can if the letter, and he's playing with a previous classical Kabbalistic idea that the world is made of letters. So he's a bit of a joke. He's saying, like, what he's saying is like, well, if the world is made of letters, and you can vowelize letters differently in Hebrew, then
which then changes the meaning of the word.
Yeah, exactly. You can just literally change the meaning of the thing that you're looking at by looking at it differently. Like the world itself, you can revowelize.
Very cool.
Right? They can kind of, and you can play with things. And I think that's what makes them both funny, right? Like the idea of like play and messing around with words and facts and language. And they both liked puns a lot. And I think that, the second chapter was kind of embracing that kind of thing and what it means to kind of play with reality and facts and use things to your advantage. And the third chapter was a bit heavier. The third chapter was about the kind of the system behind that, kind of the really Chinese or the really Jewish thing that allowed them to kind of get behind that. It was about the idea of nothingness as an explanation for those things. That for Zhuangzi, there's a capital N nothing. There's a big nothing behind reality, and because there's nothing there, there's no reason. There's no thing you have to be consistent to, to defer to, or have allegiance to, and that's what allows you to kind of change all the time, to assume different models as they make sense, which is a really, as obviously abstract idea, but and it's a good demonstration also of Chinese thought. And I think for both of them also, this idea that the only reason it's interesting that there's a nothing behind reality is because it allows you to live better. Because there's a nothing behind reality, it's not nihilistic. It allows you to embrace the nothing, to understand the people around you and the events around you at a more intuitive, like a Ming kind of a way. Or because it allows you to use different facts and models and ways of thinking about the world, and different ideologies as you see fit, rather than sticking to one, which is one solution will never solve all of your problems.
What's that word for him?
Ming.
The
Oh,
nothing.
nothingness.
Hmm.
The Tao.
Okay, sweet.
The Tao, hence Daoism. Yeah.
Nice.
Tao is kind of is the big nothing.
Nice.
The big. He's dealing already with what I was talking about in the very beginning of this whole conversation was the Tao Te Ching, the earlier sort of Daoists call it kind of their first work. 81 poems written by a guy named Lao Tzu, who may or may not have existed. Lao Tzu spoke all frequently about the Tao as this seemingly like mystical. It's a big debate about exactly what he's talking about, but the Tao is a seemingly mystical kind of thing that's like that is and isn't there and can be tapped into to make you a better person. Better not necessarily morally, but to like live more efficiently or accurately, whatever it is, to get what you want done, to get it done. And one kind of sort of a classic metaphor that he uses to describe it is that the Tao is like the spoke, the hub in the center of the spokes of a wheel, that the spokes spin around it, but they can spin because of the nothingness in the middle. Or like he says also, like a vessel is useful because of the space inside that you can fit it in. You don't measure a vessel by the walls, or a house by the walls. You measure it by the livable space. So it's actually space and nothingness that allows things to be useful. And Zhuangzi really went crazy with that. He like took it to a crazy extreme, and you read it as a metaphor for logic and living itself. And it says like, because there's nothing that really justifies logic itself, you can use different logical models, different ideologies, different ways of thinking, different ways of understanding, often that are contradictory, just as you see fit, or you don't need to use them at all. You could just jump straight to the nothingness and just live purely at intuition. For Rabbi Nachman also, this idea of what I think it is for him is Keter, right? It's the top sphere, like we were talking about, the top body part of God, which is also one of the other names for it is Ayin, is nothingness. That the closest we can get to God is kind of actually the revelation of nothingness. The way the Kabbalists would put this frequently is that if you look straight into the sun, you see nothing. That the closest revelation you can get to the infinite is actually a big zero. And that's kind of the closest we can get to God. So Rabbi Nachman, I think, saw Keter also, just like Zhuangzi saw the Tao is either a thing that you could circle around, and kind of as life changes, keep changing with it, around the nothingness in the center, and that there is no need to be consistent because the lines don't touch, they all go to this big zero. Or you can jump straight to the zero and live a life based on intuition and instinct and impulse and efficiency, and comfort and liberty and whatever it is. It's for Rabbi Nachman, you can jump straight to Keter, and live also in a space of intuition, of understanding the bechina of everything around you, and you don't need to be held back by the knowledge that actually interferes with your relationship with God. Or you can kind of, as ways of getting to Keter, and notice already the kind of almost spatial language that I'm describing these things with, for both of them is different, right? It's Jewish and Chinese. That I think the for Rabbi Nachman, the way of getting almost climbing the line or the ladder to Keter is probably the way I'd put it for him, like a vertical metaphor, is you go through the other sefirot, you assume different modes of knowledge, and again, they can contradict at different times, and it's not. So the way I like to kind of explain my whole thesis with that knowledge now in like a really quick analogy is, and I think it'll make a lot more sense having heard all of it. Just I'll kind of close with this, I guess, is I think when you have I think let's talk about like econ. Let's talk about economics, right? When you're like 8 in the lunchroom, the economic model that makes the most sense is bartering, is trading. You have graham crackers, and like your friend has little bite brownies, which are two things that I currently have to my left. Are what's it called? And so you want to trade, and you're like, if your friend says, well, how about instead of that, I give you this, sheet of paper, and you take that sheet of paper and give it to someone else. You're just like, what? Like, I want your brownies, man. Like, what is that? Like, like, I don't need your like abstract principle. Like, that's insane. Like, I'm 8. And I think that so that's the economic system that makes most sense when you're 8. Then you grow up a little bit and you go to high school. You learn about, I don't know, capitalism in like a typical Western high school. And it makes a lot more sense to you. You understand why like money is valuable as like a store of exchange and this kind of thing. And or stock of value, means of exchange, whatever the fancy terms are. And I don't know, then you grow up, you go to college, and you get into like leftism, and you read, you have like a really leftist professor or two, and you read the Communist Manifesto like once, and you decide that communism is like is the way to go. And then, no disrespect to your communist viewers, And then you and it's what makes sense to you. It's like, it's not fair that people are treated the way they are, and capitalism exploits those people and allows you to relate to people like cashiers and lawyers and all the stuff we were talking about before. And then a few years go by, you make a living, you realize what was wrong about your views in college, your views in high school, your views when you were a kid, like all of it. And you, as you go older and older and older, you learn more, and it changes your views. And that's not so crazy. So I think that's a fact, right? That your views change in life. I met a guy once it was in the middle of when I was writing my thesis, so I was like really annoying and self-righteous about this kind of stuff. And I was constantly thinking about it. And I met him, and he was like an avowed communist. He was like 25 or 26, and we were like at a bar. He's like a friend of a friend, and it came up that he was like really into communism, and he was like saying some stuff that I thought was crazy and disagreed with. And I asked him, and I said, and he said to me, he's like, so you don't think that like the history of like class struggle is like not like the truth about like all of history? Like that's what all of history, you know what I mean? And I was like, well, it's like one way of telling the story. Like, he's like, how do you not whatever? And I said, well, like, let me ask you something. Like, did you think that when you were 12? And he's like, no. And I was like, well, do you think now? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, well, do you think you're going to think it also when you're 60? And he's like, yeah, definitely. And I'm like, so you think like you didn't know the truth, and then you found the truth, and you're always going to have it forever? Like, that's so arrogant. Like, you know what I mean? Like, to think that so I think that's truth changes, and it should. And I think that and like that guy thought that he was wrong, and now he's right, and he's always going to be right. And that itself, like thinking that you're right now, is not inherently damaging, I think, right? I think thinking that you found the objective truth forever is an arrogant thing. But I think to assume that what you believe in is worth believing in is obviously, like, it'd be crazy to do otherwise. Not crazy, I don't know. There are ways to do it, but it's hard. And I think that Rabbi Nachman and Zhuangzi have very different ways of explaining that fact. I think Rabbi Nachman sees it as the change as vertical. He sees change as you're always getting more right. Right, kind of like in calculus, you get infinitely close to the axis, but you never reach it necessarily. When you have like an asymptote or whatever, none of those economic models is necessarily a fact. But it is true that capitalism is a superior economic system to bartering. It is true that communism is a superior like economic system to what you believed in high school, right? And you kept dropping earlier truths, shedding earlier truths that you had because you found something better. And they were better. They're actually more right? But you're never at the end. There's degrees of rightness, but you're never finished. So that's kind of Rabbi Nachman's conception of truth. He thinks of truth as like a ladder, like I said before, it's like
approximations of truth.
Exactly. I think that's exactly the phrase I used in my third chapter at one point. That you're kind of you're always partially approximating the infinite, which is like the really capital T true, but you're never getting there. You're always getting there, but you never do. So Zhuangzi thinks of truth in a very Chinese way, in a very Daoist way, not as vertical, because he doesn't believe in a God, not Vidavka, not like deliberately. He never really occurred to him. He doesn't live in that society, right? He doesn't know about Aristotle or Plato. He doesn't have these ideas that there's a transcendent truth, which is such a Western idea that we cannot escape, right? This idea that there's like one me, that there's like that I have to be true to, that's a transcendent me, right? That's where that comes from. And I think, but Zhuangzi doesn't think that. Zhuangzi thinks of truth as horizontal. He thinks of you're always going around the way I kind of like a circle, right? You're not going up or down. You're just moving. You get to pick up this item that you want today, and you put it down when it doesn't suit you anymore, and you pick up another one. So I think is bartering like worse than socialism? Like, it's not necessarily inferior, right? I mean, like we said before, like capitalism does not work for the 8-year-old. He doesn't want money. He wants little diaper brownies. It's not really clear to me that like capitalism is a superior system for everybody. It's just why, like, the only difference, you happen to be getting older, you're like getting taller and aging. That's like time is moving forward. Like, that's a fact. But like what works and but the other way of thinking about it is like, well, there's 18-year-old you and 50-year-old you and 8-year-old you, and they're all 3 different people, and they all exist next to each other. And, and they all have different things that work for them. Right. And like when one ceases to work, you have to pick up another one. And that's kind of, and it's, and the way it has, both of those models have very different implications. They have very common implications for how they think of truth in general, which is that and they have very different implications for how they think of like what the goal is, and how to use different ideologies, and different situations in which you can use them, and what the point is, right? Is the point to worship God? Is the point to know yourself? Is the point to live a good life? But at the end of the day, they both really don't like ideology. They don't think that there's one answer to anything, and they think it's arrogant to be able to think that you've found that you've found the truth, that you're done, that you're never done. I think it's kind of an absurd statement for different reasons, but for both of them. So I guess that's kind of the project in a nutshell, I guess.
That's so epic.
Yeah.
That's like, And I hear what you're saying, that you get to see in their similarity, their unique differences
exactly.
in that spatial model. I was, as you were saying that, I was wondering if because the Kabbalists also have two different models of reality, of Igul and Yosher.
Yeah.
I was wondering if that came up at all. Igul being sort of a circular model, and Yosher being the linear,
Right.
or the feminine and the masculine as well.
Yeah. So I think those are still, my limited impression of Igul and Yosher is they're still subsumed under the Kabbalistic model, which is Rabbi Nachman, the vertical model. Like, I know that at least in the Ramchal, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, that his conception of Igul and Yosher is there's still linearity to them. There's just like, one is literally linear, like one it's a ladder, but the other one is concentric circles that get bigger and bigger and bigger. So in Igul, you're not necessarily going around as much.
Right.
So there's still an idea, like there's a truth, it's just different ways of, I mean, that's a really interesting question. Like it's like what exactly that might mean. The difference between approaching an end, whether through circles or in a ladder. Like, I don't really know,
You're right. It's concentricity. So it's still moving away or towards.
Exactly. Yeah. But I do know of at least one idea in Rav Tzadok of Lublin. He says at one point on Parshat Korach that he relates the idea of hierarchy of believing in a hierarchy of people in the world to Yosher, which he considers like a this worldly thing. Like, you have to believe that there are people who are meant to who are superior and inferior to other people, but that in the world of the divine, there are that's Yosher, but in the world of the divine, there's Igul, there's like circularity, and there isn't, and everyone's equidistant from the center.
Yeah, interesting.
There's like truth is much more relative, which is like not totally all the way there to like the Chinese level, but it's like a lot of the way there.
That is
it's
very
like
interesting.
he has some idea that like he has like a postmodern nature of truth, kind of, that not necessarily put truth, but there's some idea of like equality of truth to some extent. Of different people, different people are all equally relevant to the grand scheme of things and what they believe and everything. And he equates that with like circles, which is like super interesting.
But that's reserved for like the Messianic or the eschatological.
Yeah, exactly. He thinks the problem is the story of Korach, right? Who rebels against Moshe. Is he thinks his whole problem is that he's jumping to the next world too soon.
Yeah, that's so fascinating.
By trying to subvert hierarchy, by rebelling against the leader.
He's trying to immanentize the eschatology.
Is the academic way to put it.
It's so wild, and I'm sure Rav Tzadok over there quotes the idea of like that God makes us a circle of tzaddikim, and he sits in the center. I saw someone else talking about this in regards to Jethro and Moses, where Jethro instructs Moses that he needs to create a hierarchical system of judiciary infrastructure. Wow. So I want to wrap up by asking you what your current projects are, just to get a sense of where you are right now and what's exciting, what's fresh for you, and perhaps what you could clue the listeners into if they could be expecting to see something or to follow something if they've come till this far. I'm sure they've been enjoying you and your thinking. So that's one thing, and then we'll just conclude with some final thoughts. But
so truth is, instead of like I've been in a bit of a hiatus, just like reading stuff and thinking about a lot of this kind of stuff. So I'm taking a bit of time off, quarantine and whatnot. I'm just kind of chilling, trying to make sense out of stuff. But so nothing in particular. I was thinking about writing an article for the Lair House. Also, we'll see if I get around to it and if they like it and whatever. But I was thinking about writing up a thing about what was it? I haven't thought about this in a bit. I had this project about the mysticism and rationalism as being about body and mind, as being whether this idea of sort of what we've been talking, how you act differently in different contexts, kind of thinking of the mind and the body as different contexts. And am I like isolated, or say like rationalism thinks you're sort of a mind, but mysticism thinks there's always a context. You're always in a body. You're always like that. And talking a little bit about a really interesting story from actually revolutionary China in like the 40s, where they hopefully you'll see some more details up if I get around to it and if they like it, but about where they put one of their gods on trial during the communist revolution in China. It's just a really interesting story about how people in traditional China might think about body and mind and what that means. And I was thinking
like a
about
very Jewish thing to do.
Yeah, it kind of does. I think the last chapter of Elie Wiesel's Night, which I never read, does like have that very similar story. Yeah, it's something, and I think there's something to that. So yeah, I'm thinking about that, and but beyond that, I'm not really, to be honest, working on anything in particular. I'm definitely open to the idea of the future. I'm just, like I said, reading a little bit about history and novels, hanging out, having a good time. And,
this might be a good time to ask you. I remember a while back I had asked you to make a video for the channel.
Yeah.
And you told me that you were thinking of doing one on the creative process as conceptualized by the Kabbalistic schema.
Yeah, totally.
So I'm just going to put that back out to you that offer is still out there, and for all the listeners who are enjoying your content, that we do hope to see your thoughts in video form as well.
That's another thing. Yeah, definitely. How Kabbalah has to do with art and music and writing and
I mean, we didn't really explore that, but you're also a creative beyond just the intellectual. You're engaged in music and
definitely. It's definitely a thing I'd like to get. Maybe I'll get around to it this week. We'll see what happens.
I would be very excited. What I've been doing with some of the other guys is I've gotten 2 like bits of content from them, the interview and their bit of content, and then I'm going to release them one following the other.
Very cool. Okay. That's good.
So that offers there, and I would definitely be excited to see that. Any closing words for the seekers out there?
In general, I think, this was really cool, ton of fun. I always love talking about this stuff and have it rolling around my brain. So love talking to you about this thing. Like,
awesome. Likewise.
It's exciting. Yeah, I think it's exciting to think that me and you and a bunch of other people hopefully have like a common language to think about this stuff. And I think in general, I don't know if I can give some unsolicited advice to anybody. It'd just be like to kind of get down to penetrate through not just to the knowledge but to the wisdom, to figure out. Ask yourself. There's always a reason why you're learning what you're learning, and don't be so naive as to think it's just because it's cool and you're interested. Why something's cool to you is a super important live question, and always ask it and always figure out why you like the things you like, and I think that'll take you into a really deep place.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gavi. Where can people find you online if they want to find more of your material, your content? Do you have a platform, a social media that you want to direct people to?
Just frankly, just like my Facebook at this point.
Nice.
I'm like putting stuff up. My thesis is online on like the Brandeis University, like online library, whatever it is. So just, look up my name at Brandeis, or just, literally just Facebook me. It's where everything's kind of nothing's centralized right now. And it's not like, I'm in grad school yet or anything, got some sort of central location, but hopefully that stuff will be on the horizon. So
nice.
Feel free to hit me up.
Nice. Thank you so much. That was epic. That was fantastic.
Yeah, this was awesome, Zed.
I really, really enjoyed.
I love that you're doing this.
Enjoy the rest of your day. It's like midday for you there, right?
Yeah, I was also up till like freaking 5 a.m. last night, but you got to go to bed too. So
wow.
Dude, thanks for being interested, man. This is really cool.
It's such a pleasure, honestly. I'm so excited to see like what's going to come with everyone sharing and everyone getting to sort of virtually meet each other and see each other's ideas.
Totally. Me too. Me too. Let me know. Keep me in the loop about what's going on and everybody else's stuff and everything.
Absolutely. Awesome. So that was the conversation with Gavi Kutliroff. What a genius. What a good man. What a friend. Oh, it's just sometimes a conversation can throw you into a different state of being. And I feel like I'm in a different plane right now. So I will catch you back on the other side. Subscribe, like, share, and let us transcend beyond the being and nothingness. Words are meaningless at this point, so peace out.